In this post of Theology and Religion with J.D. Reiner, we will continue our discussion of the philosophy of history by examining its speculative branch. Last time, we defined that field as answering the why questions of history. Let us provide a more complete definition here than we did last time. The Encyclopedia Britannica has a rather good definition in my view. According to the article writer Patrick Gardner, speculative philosophy of history is conceived to be a first-order inquiry, its subject matter being the historical process as a whole, and its aim being, broadly speaking, one of providing an overall elucidation or explanation of the course and direction taken by that process. So even though the goal is relatively clear, this is not a field blessed by an intellectual consensus, as you will come to see. Speculative views have differed profusely and immensely from place to place and time to time. Within the next 10 to 15 minutes, probably closer to 15 minutes really, I will attempt to summarize the major answers given in Western civilization, from the ancient world until the late 19th century. Obviously, that will be very difficult to do with justice, but if you are certainly free to explore further by looking up the information that I provide in the footnotes. Again, most of the information here comes from M.C. Levin's very thorough 2003 survey, Philosophy of History, A Guide for Students, as well as a few encyclopedia articles and another book or two. So let us begin with the Greco-Roman world. Although the pre-classical world had a sense that there is an overall meaning behind history, the first substantial attempts to understand it came from ancient Greece and Rome. For anyone who knows about how interested in philosophy the ancient Greeks were, this makes sense, especially since it is the Greek writer Herodotus who is called the father of history due to his accounts about the Greeks and the Persians. The Greeks developed the idea that the world could be understood because all things had underlying principles. Thus, it was possible to find underlying principles within human history as well. Using this idea, many Greco-Roman philosophers argued that history moves in cycles. This means that there are patterns of events which repeat themselves, perhaps eternally. After all, the natural world and the heavens have cyclical patterns, so why not history? And because history moves in cycles, many of them thought that fate made human events inevitable and unavoidable. The Greco-Roman world also had a biological analogy for understanding history. Just as biological organisms could grow and decay, so could human civilizations. And of course, civilizations grew and decayed according to the cycles of history. Additionally, their common idea that human nature never changes further enforced their perception that historical events were inevitable in some sense. So let us move on to the spread of Christianity. So the spreading of Christianity in the Roman Empire ushered in a large paradigm shift in the speculative philosophy of history. Christian views of history stemmed from Jewish apocalypticism, which saw history as linear rather than cyclical. History was about the struggle between good and evil, and the end would come at the ultimate defeat of the cosmic forces of evil, when God would raise all the dead and judge them according to their works. Christians brought this idea with them as they converted pagans to Christ, who they believed was the Messiah that the Jews were awaiting and who would be the judge at the end of the world. A Christian bishop living in the late 4th and early 5th centuries was the first scholar to codify a speculative view of history that would come to dominate the Western world for hundreds of years. His name was Augustine of Hippo, known within the tradition as St. Augustine. In his famous book, The City of God, Augustine framed the meaning of history within the idea that there were two metaphorical cities, the earthly city and the heavenly city. The point of historical existence in the earthly city was to prepare for existence in the heavenly city, which is the city of God. Thus, history is fundamentally about God's plan for the eternal destination of humans, according to how they respond to God's offer of grace. Later discussions of the philosophy of history from the Middle Ages onward, or even late antiquity onward, I should say, interacted directly with Augustine, so his work is of immense importance. This Christian speculative philosophy of history dominated Europe until the Renaissance. In this period, though, the humanist movement developed, which glorified the achievements of the classical world and viewed the Middle Ages as an intellectually dark time. Indeed, it was these humanists who first came up with the idea of the Middle Ages in the first place as a way to criticize the former eras. That was the environment which produced the Italian intellectual Giambattista Vico, whom modern experts regard as the first true philosopher of history. Vico believed that the overall meaning of history was for human societies to realize their full potential. He thought that societies progressively approached this goal in stages, which he described as the age of gods, the age of heroes, and the age of men. Progress through these stages was the goal of providence for history. After the Renaissance, there was a shift in European thinking, and scholars today call that shift the Enlightenment. Many intellectuals in Britain, France, Germany even, and elsewhere began to distrust authority and tradition, especially the claims of Christianity. These intellectuals introduced a new focus on reason and progress to the meaning of history. The French politician and scientist Turgot was one of the first Enlightenment thinkers to introduce a speculative philosophy of history. He traced humanity's history as progressing from states of irrationality to states of increasing rationality. This corresponded to increasing peace and prosperity in human societies over time. For Turgot, the meaning was clear. Humans would make historical progress if they applied rational principles to society. Another French philosopher named Condorcet developed Turgot's ideas of progress. He, however, tried to frame history within atheistic and naturalistic terms. That was something that hadn't quite been done before up until this time, and so he's doing a new thing. So to that end, he avoided references to biblical narratives, which perfectly illustrates the contemporary intellectual distrust of religious authority. Although I should add that he did this even though scholars today know that there is a great deal of authentically historical material embedded in the biblical tradition, but back then he had no reason to think so he discounted it. So he charted 10 stages of history, tracing human progress from simple societies to more complex and scientific ones. Again, that theme of progress in science and reason showing up in the Enlightenment. Other ideas about speculative philosophy of history arose during this period too. An Irish member of the British Parliament named Edmund Burke proposed a more evolutionary understanding of how human societies developed. He believed that cultures responded to historical phenomena organically, evolving their institutions slowly without a single designer controlling them. Varied traditions and conventions arose within societies because they worked, and as long as they continued to work, then they remained, although not remaining unshaped by succeeding generations. So let's go on to the more modern period. The approach of modernity brought the final wave of speculative philosophies before many of these philosophers began focusing more on the analytical philosophy of history. Two men stand out in this field, namely G.W.F. Hegel and Karl Marx. Oh, it's easy to get these words mixed together now after having to say them so many times. Hegel produced a comprehensive view of the overall meaning of history. Marx came to reject it and proposed a new understanding. Hegel was a German scholar who was active around the Napoleonic Wars. He developed the idea that the point of history was for the ultimate spirit to become conscious of itself, and that his philosophy was the turning point in this self-understanding. A professor of philosophy named Philip Carey summarizes his ideas well. Hegel contended that the whole of world history unfolds according to a divine and necessary logic. History unfolds dialectically, i.e., according to a logic in which every conflict is subsumed in a higher unity. This unfolding is the process by which Geist, the universal mind or divine spirit, alienates itself in the external world, but eventually comes back to itself in self-knowledge. As you can see, Hegel's focus here is on spirit rather than on matter. He even gets a little theological, which is perhaps a slight return to the Christian tradition compared to the Enlightenment theories that we just discussed. But it would be a mistake, however, to think that his view of God as the universal spirit coming to recognize itself is truly orthodox in any classical framing of Christian doctrine, but I'll leave that up to other people to debate, those who know more about his views. Finally, we come to Karl Marx, another German. Most of us are familiar with Marx as a major figure in economics and even sociology, but he is not often thought of as a philosopher of history. Yet, his view of how history works is essential to his ideas about both economic and sociological truths. Although Hegel initially influenced Marx heavily, Marx eventually rejected his ideas. Marx came to believe that Hegelianism made a mistake by emphasizing spirit over matter. Remember, this was something very important to Hegel. So to Marx, people make decisions based on material needs rather than spiritual ideas or concepts or those sorts of things. And so history is primarily about economic needs and control over the economic resources. Marx's philosophy presented history as the process of a class struggle. He charted several stages of history, from the ancient world to the industrial period, in which he discusses the ways that these class struggles manifest themselves. The end of history, in his view, would culminate in a perfect society run by humans' voluntary adherence to communist ideals. So let's go to our conclusion. So that was a longer post, but perhaps you can see how long and varied the history of speculative philosophy has been. If you are watching this on YouTube or Odyssey, then I invite you to like the video and follow me to see future posts. You can visit my website, jdreiner.com, to see all of my work in one place, or send an email to jonathandreiner@gmail.com to get in touch with me. You can also donate to the work using the links in the description. Thanks for your attention, and I will see you next time.